When you have a game as old as Warframe, a 13-year-old title, there are bound to be some myths perpetuated by veteran players and some general confusion. And today we are going to look at 5 of the biggest myths floating around the Warframe community, confusing new players, and we're going to clear those up. Welcome back to the channel, Tenno. We're going to go ahead and clear up 5 of the biggest myths. I'm going to rapid fire a couple of these because there's one in particular that we're going to go into a lot of detail about. So we're going to start with number 1, and that is going to be that you should not main a frame. Warframe has got 59 unique Warframes at this point, and a lot of current frames also have prime variants. So I understand it's hard to a point to pick a frame to main, but if you find one that really vibes with you, there's nothing wrong with playing that frame. I will say that it kind of detracts. You don't really get to experience the full game and everything the game has to offer, but if that's the way you want to play, there's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of other opportunities to raise your mastery rank. However, what I would advise if you want to main a frame is go ahead and grind for those other frames, build them up, and then you can do like a mission like Hydron on Sedna, which is a defense, play several waves, get to master rank 30 with them, and then you can do whatever you want to with them, sell them. And I wouldn't sell them anymore. That used to be what I would do. But now that they have the helmet, if you have the helmet unlocked, you can subsume them, which I think is the best use for frames that you have no intention of using. Moving on to number 2, mastery ranks do not need as much as you think they do. Typically what a mastery rank is going to indicate is that a person may have played for a while, but more specifically that they definitely leveled a lot of items and frames, especially if their mastery rank is quite high. It does not mean that they are better than the game at you. It does not mean they know more about the game than you. So do not be intimidated about someone's mastery rank. Do not be afraid to ask questions. And the Warframe community is really nice. It rarely happens, but should you find yourself in the position in which a high mastery rank player is, kind of talking down to you, trying to make you feel some kind of way, you don't have to take that. Just understand that it doesn't. The mastery rank doesn't always reflect skill. But moving on to number 3, we're going to talk about status chance. There's this myth going around the Warframe community that if you don't have enough status chance, your status weapons will not do damage. Example, if you use a mod like Blaze, we'll use for example, and it does deal additional 60% damage plus another 60% Blaze damage. The myth is that if you don't have enough status chance, that Blaze will not do that 60% damage, and that is untrue. How it works is the higher status chance you have, the more likely it is that the enemies will be set ablaze. However, that 60% damage increase from the Blaze will take effect regardless of if status effects proc, if that makes any sense. I'm going to get more into damage types and their effects in just a second, but it's important to remember, so if you take the mod Blaze again, for example, regardless of your status chance, you are still going to be doing an additional 120% damage. We're going to move on to tip number 4 here, and it's a myth as old as time when it comes to Warframe, and it is the good old bullet jump. There's a myth going around that the bullet jump will increase your evasiveness / decrease enemies' accuracy when aiming at you, and this is just not true. Bullet jump is fun to use, it's flashy, it's a good way to traverse the terrain, but it does nothing for your evasiveness / reducing the enemy's accuracy. Moving on to number 5, we're going to break this up to several sections, but this is the which weapon is better argument. There's a myth that has been perpetuated for as long as I can remember in Warframe that not all weapons are created equal, and there are weapons that are head and shoulders above the rest and making a ton of weapons irrelevant. And this is partially true, but mostly false, because Warframe is a game with tons of possibility with literally hundreds of weapons. Truth be told, you can play whatever kind of weapon you want. The difference in weapons oftentimes is marginal. The big thing to remember is that weapons can be best described as being keys. They're certainly useful and they can fit a lot of locks, but no one weapon is going to fit all locks. So they each have a specific role to fill. They have different types of damage that they deal. And what I would like to do now is get into the basic types of damage. There are 3 basic physical types, as well as 4 basic elemental types of damage that weapons as well as frames can deal. Starting us off with the first physical type is going to be Slash. This is going to apply bleed to your enemies. This is going to deal 35% base damage per second for 6 seconds after a 1 second delay. These stacks are not limited, and each stack has its own duration. So basically, these are going to be the ones that cause bleed damage. And a good example of weapons that are going to deal slash is Soma. I think is the best example back in the day. It was known as the King of Slash as well as the King of Critical Chance. But if you're looking for other beginner examples, you could say the Vasto, the AK Vastos, or the Mark 1 Bratton. Moving right along, we're going to look at impact damage, and it is going to cause a knockback effect. It's going to cause the target to flinch and stagger movement for 1 second, with higher stacks causing longer status duration. For 6 seconds, it's going to increase the health threshold for a Parazon finisher by 8% up to 5 stacks. Just like with Slash, each stack is going to have its own duration. And what that means about the Parazon finisher is that the more staggered they are, the less health you have to take away from an enemy to use your Parazon finisher on them, depending on how many stacks of stagger that you have on them. Good examples of weapons that would be good for impact are going to be heavy melees, the heavy blades, the hammers, the Karak, the AK Magnus, the Magnus. If you're looking for beginner weapons, any weapons like that are going to grant you a higher increased chance of proccing impact damage. Moving on to our final form of physical damage, we have Puncture, and it is going to induce a weakened state on enemies. It's going to reduce the damage dealt by the target by 40% and increased received critical chance by 5% for 6 seconds. Subsequent puncture status effects are going to add plus 10% weakening, leading up to 80% reduced damage and as well as 25% critical chance at 5 stacks. And again, just like the other two, each stack is going to have its own duration. Some weapons that are good examples of puncture weapons are going to be the Vacor Heck, the Vacor, the Boltor, as well as the Gaiku. And really quickly, before we move on to the 4 basic elements, I'm going to do a rundown of the enemy factions that are vulnerable to each physical damage type. So when we have Impact, they're going to be vulnerable, that's going to be strong against the Grineer as well as the Cougar Grineer and the Scaldra. Puncture is going to be strong against the Corpus and the Orichan. And Slash is going to be strong against the Infested and the Murmurs. Really quick before we get on to the basic elements, if you guys have made it this far and you're enjoying the video, you're learning anything, make sure you smash that like button and perhaps even sub to the channel. We would love to have you guys as part of the community. I make daily Warframe guides and videos. Alrighty, moving on to heat damage. When it's dealt on an enemy, it will deal 50% base damage as heat. That damage will be dealt over 6 seconds, and after 1 second delay, it will cause the target to panic for 4 seconds, stripping up to 50% of the shield for 2 seconds. These stacks are not limited. When dealing damage to a player, if you are dealt heat damage, it will deal 50% of the base damage over 6 seconds, as well as strip 50% of your armor over the course of 2 seconds. So it's important to remember that with these elements, it's not just the damage that you do to enemies, the enemies can also deal this elemental damage to you as well. And since we were talking about the elements, it's important to remember that the higher status chance you have on your weapons or frame is more likely that you will get like that panic, as well as stripping of armor when it comes to heat damage, for example. And that is also true with the physical damage, but I think it's easier to remember when it comes to the elemental damage. A couple examples of mods that will grant you heat damage are Wildfire, Thermite Rounds, as well as Hellfire. Moving on to cold damage, and buckle up because this is a bit of a long explanation. It will apply freeze damage. On an enemy, it will reduce movement speed, fire rate, and attack speed by 50%, and increases the critical multiplier by 0.01% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 6 times. Each subsequent proc is going to increase the slow by 5% to a total of 90%. For each stack has its own duration, and on the 10th stack, an enemy will be completely frozen for 3 seconds. This will negate their shield recharge and increase the critical multiplier by plus 1%. Upon thawing, there will be 3 stacks of cold that will remain on the enemy. This will make it easier for subsequent freezing. If you are frozen or slowed, it will reduce your movement speed and fire rate, as well as attack speed, by 25% for 6 seconds. Examples of mods that are going to grant you cold damage are going to be Ice Storm, Deep Freeze, North Wind, Cryo Rounds. Shock damage is going to deal 50% base damage as electricity per second for 6 seconds to enemies within 3 meters of the target, and it's also going to stun the affected target for 3 seconds. Each stack has its own duration. So basically it's going to be kind of a crowd control ability. It's going to chain enemies together and deal AoE damage. When dealt to you, it's going to deal 50% base damage and electricity, as well as your allies within 3 meters of you. Examples of mods that are going to grant you electric damage are going to be Stormbringer, High Voltage, Jolt, Prime Jolt, things like that. Finally, when it comes to Toxin Damage, it's going to deal 50% base damage as Toxin over 6 seconds after a single second delay. It is going to completely bypass shields. Stacks are not limited, and each stack is going to have its own duration. Contagious Spread as well as Toxic Barrage are 2 examples of mods that will grant you toxic damage. To close out the basic elemental damage, we're going to do the same thing. We'll talk about enemies that are weak and as well as resistant to each element. Starting at Cold Sentience, you're going to be weak against cold. The Tech Rot will be resistant to cold damage. Electricity Corpus will be weak against it, as well as the Murmurs will also be weak against electricity. The Kuva Grenier will be strong against fire damage. They'll be highly resistant, but the Infested will be highly susceptible to heat damage, as well as the Murmurs will be pretty much neutral on every element, but will be susceptible to toxic damage. Now, I know that was a lot of information to dump on you guys, but my main reason for doing so is I know I may have some veteran players come into the comments and be like, hey, you're wrong about that one point about weapons being pretty much the same. And I just wanted to clear it up and really explain how basic damage works. And don't get me wrong, don't take a Mark 1 Bratton unmodded or formed once with 1 mod on it into a sortie or an Archon hunt and expect to do well. I don't want to paint that picture that you could just bring a weapon unmodded and have no understanding of damage types and it still be viable. But on the flip side of that, now that you have an understanding of basic damage and how it works, as well as modding and status duration and status chance and stuff like that, you can make pretty much any weapon that you find enjoyable viable. Unbelievably, there's even more to depth to this. There are 6 advanced elements / damage types. I actually will be working on a video very soon to do them and going and do a detailed guide about them and how they work, and that'll be coming up on my channel pretty soon. But I really appreciate you guys for sticking with me. Your viewership and your patience means the world to me. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys in the stars.